Hello, and welcome to U.S. History 1301 here at Grayson College. My name is Dr. Chase Machin. I'm the instructor for your course. And hey, I just wanted to hop in here, give you an idea of what to expect, and give you a few caveats for this summary that I'm about to give you before we just dive right into your lecture, okay? First and foremost, if you haven't already viewed the introduction to this course that I've made available to you, please stop right now and go get that done. Even if you're a veteran to online courses, even here at Grayson College, take the time to go and view my introduction to this course, where I go over the course syllabus, where I go over an outline for your course in terms of where to find things and how I want things accomplished. I think it'll just make the course much more enjoyable for you, so you won't be stressing over where's this and where's that. That's number one. And number two, I'm assuming, and I'll probably repeat this in a minute, but it bears repetition. I'm assuming you're watching these because I'm telling you to. I'm also assuming that you're using any outlines I give you to this lecture content to take notes, because your exams that you will be taking in this course will be partially, if not heavily, pulled from these summaries of your chapters and concepts and topics that we're covering in first half U.S. history, okay? So I think that's it. So let's just dive straight in and get this course started for you. So I thought I'd give you some of my thoughts concerning chapter 1 and easing into, I guess, what's chapter 2. But before we do, just some caveats here. Some of my thoughts will not be in the textbook for this course. And while some of them might parallel what's in this textbook as well, I don't want that to confuse you or bother you. I'm just offering up my spin in these summaries on a few items here and there, as well as elaborating on items that may or may not be in your textbook. So, for example, what's going to follow here will be a very general, for the most part, except for a few items here and there, a summary of concepts that you should be getting from your readings. And also, and this is a general rule of thumb for all of my summaries you're going to be getting in this course, these audio and video recordings. They will oftentimes overlap chapters of your textbook. And it may seem at first glance to be a bit out of chronological order. And that's okay, as I often take a thematic approach to history, as I find students find this more appealing. It's like reading a novel or watching a film. I think students appreciate that a bit more. So remember, please use those outlines that I've made available for you as guides for your notes. And yes, again, as I said earlier, I'm assuming you're viewing and taking notes from these lectures online. And one more thing before we get started. If you haven't already done so, please read that document I made available for you for your first discussion board, that history of history. I really want you reading that, give you an idea of why historians do what they do and how they do it. So let's get started. Well, to begin, I don't think anybody here will be shocked when I tell you that the discovery of America did not begin with Christopher Columbus. You've learned since grade school that the populating of the Americas began thousands of years ago, when early humans migrated across an ancient land bridge from eastern Siberia into what is now Alaska. And this is known as Beringia, this region here that you're looking on this PowerPoint slide. These ancient humans, mostly of Mongolian stock ancestry, were the first, and I put quotes around that word first, Americans. But let's be honest, humans didn't develop here. They had to get here in some way. And as time would pass, these migrating populations would settle the Americas, as you'll read in your text and your readings. They're settling there by the beginning of the 15th century AD. We'll see these natives start to encounter Europeans in large scale as they begin their own migration in what is called the New World. Now, as time would pass, these migrating populations would settle the Americas, as your text will reveal. And by the beginning of the 15th century AD, we will see these natives start to encounter Europeans in large scale as they began their own migration into what is called the New World. As Alan Brinkley has asserted in his own U.S. History Survey, this early period of contact, and I'm quoting Brinkley, this early period of contact between American and European civilization was sometimes friendly, and it was sometimes mutually beneficial, but mostly It was catastrophic for the American natives, or Indians as Europeans called them, both because they were not able to match European technologies in battle and because they were highly vulnerable to European diseases. Plagues from Europe decimated the native populations in many parts of the Americas and made the European conquest of these continents that much easier. By the late 16th century, Europeans had established a claim to all the lands of the Americas and actual control over much of it. Now look guys, I'm going to be using the name Native Americans and Indian interchangeably, but no one really knows what to call them from a historical and anthropological standpoint. They didn't have a collective name for themselves. Each group had a name for themselves, but not a name for all Indians. We, of course, know how they came to be called Indians due to Columbus thinking he had landed in Asia. Europeans called the area he was trying to go to the Indies, thus Indians. So there's that. Now, what I like to do here is just kind of walk you through some of this material. And like I've stated before, this is a cursory example at best. You're going to see a lot of this in your readings. I'm just kind of highlighting and pointing out those things I think are most important. So again, kind of some repetition here, but I think it's important, and you'll see this on your first exam. Again, no one is certain when the first migrations into the Americas began. Recent estimates suggest they started between 14 and 16,000 years ago, but I'm telling you right now, you go down to a local bookstore, pick up any anthropological textbook, and I guarantee you, if you put one and one beside each other, they're going to have different dates in them, because every grad student in America that's in an anthropological program, they're doing research and they're coming up with new dates, right? So, roughly speaking, 14 to 16,000 years ago, people started moving across that area of Beringia we were talking about earlier. And as a side note, one of my professors from grad school, Dr. Harlan Hagler, loved to tell of all the various myths as to the origins of Native Americans. Where did it come from? And one of the earliest myths about this was after Columbus's fourth voyage. Europeans began to realize that, hey, this is not the Indies. And they started wondering, okay, well, if it's not the Indies, who the heck are these people we're running into? And there was this old myth, this old legend, this old story that came back from the Middle Ages, that all people in the world could be traced back to the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, they can't, but they thought that, right? But that was the story. And that kind of gone away. Well, now they started bumping into these peoples in, quote-unquote, the New World. And the Europeans claimed, not knowing much beyond the area of the Mediterranean, that they now could place everyone in those tribes, except for that lost 12th tribe. And so when they started bumping into Native Americans in the New World, they said, hey, it's the lost 12th tribe of Israel. And I'm not lying, it was a huge story in the 16th century of Europe that they had found the lost tribe of Israel. Anyway, I find those types of stories pretty interesting. I know Dr. Hagler loved it. But again, most anthropologists today say that these Native Americans, these first Americans, came from Asia over long periods in small bands across that Bering Strait, that area of Beringia. So again, Native Americans, the majority of migration to North, Middle, and South America occurred across Beringia. Okay? Now, there are a lot of theories out there as to why were these people migrating out of Asia. And I'm just going to give you a handful here. The first one we could call the theory of, I guess you could call it a catastrophe theory, catastrophism, if you want to put an ism on the end of it. And this one goes that, about 10,000 years ago, these first Americans were not following herds of game, but were in fact fleeing volcanic activity and horrible weather conditions in Asia. Something was scaring the fire out of them, and it forced them to go across Beringia. Another theory holds that these first Americans were in fact arriving to already established civilizations in South America. In other words, that these people traveling from Asia, I guess represented in these red and orange lines, were in fact arriving to pre-populated areas in Middle and South America with peoples that were there before them. Okay? And that's kind of an interesting theory. And this theory is directly attributed to a gentleman by the name of Thor Heyerdahl. And I really like this guy. He's got a wonderful story around him. And so Heyerdahl believed in that controversial opinion. And it's got merit. Heyerdahl was a Norwegian anthropologist noted for his studies of cultural diffusion. And he had this theory that some people arrived to Middle and South America by boat across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. And of course, people ridiculed and laughed at him and said it was impossible. So Heyerdahl began an extensive study of testing his theory on the origins of the Polynesian race and culture. And he suggested that migration to Polynesia had followed the natural North Pacific conveyor out there in the ocean. And so, long story short, Heyerdahl said people got here across the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans way before those Native Americans arrived by foot crossing Beringia. And he was ridiculed in the scholarly circles. So what did he do? He built a boat. He called it Kon-Tiki. He decided to build a replica of what an Aboriginal balsa raft would look like. Used elements that would have been available to peoples in that time period. And in 1947, Heyerdahl and 5 of his buddies left Peru and sailed 4,300 miles, about 101 days, to reach Polynesia. Now, people said that was a fluke. So you got lucky, Thor. You can't base a theory of European exploration off of a fluke. Well, a few years later, in the late 60s, early 70s, Heyerdahl said, well, I'll do it again. And so he built He built a boat called Ra-1, built it out of papyrus, which the ancient Egyptians and Mediterranean peoples used to make paper, right, guys? He built a boat out of paper, and he sailed it across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, he ran into some troubles. His boat sank in a hurricane, so he built it again, called it Ra-2, and he completed his voyage, sailing some 3,200 miles in 57 days. Look, I know I'm rambling on here. I just really love this guy, and I love these stories. I'm not going to expect you to know all the names of these boats. I'm not going to expect you to know about how many attempts he made. I just want you to know the guy's name and know he's associated with that theory of people having already had, there was a possibility that people could have migrated to Middle and South America prior to the majority of migration coming out of Beringia. That's all I want you to remember, and you'll be fine. Heyerdahl, what makes him important is that he showed modern science, modern historians and anthropologists, that this theory that Mediterranean vessels, right, built prior to Columbus, he took that theory that they could not have sailed the Atlantic, and he turned it on its head. And people had to start giving it serious attention that this was a true possibility. Mr. Heyerdahl. Again, great character in history. For us nerds in history, he's a hero. He's a rock star. So look, another thing you want to consider. Again, you're looking at these going, oh my God, Dr. Mates is going to make me memorize all these Native American groups. Absolutely not. I'm just showing you a picture of all the different these are all based on, languages and different groups of Native Americans at the time of early European exploration. Look, there's a tremendous debate to the populations of Native Americans at the time of Columbus, 1492, right? 1491 then. And it's hard to arrive at what was the exact populations in 1491, a year prior to Columbus. It really is. And that's due to the tremendous death rates Native Americans suffered due to disease when Europeans arrived. The current estimate for all of Native Americans in all of the Americas is that there were approximately about 50 million. And these estimates keep going up as new evidence is found. Now, Native Americans had been isolated from outside contact, thus that they had no immunity to European disease. For example, measles were deadly to natives, but they weren't to Europeans. The big killer for Native Americans was smallpox, obviously, and you know that from your readings. And the estimates are that within 100 years from 1492, think about this, within 100 years from 1492, 50% of all Native Americans were dead just simply due to disease. A few people even argue that it was as high as 80 to 90% dead due to disease within 100 years. Columbus even stated that when he arrived, that there was as many as 3 million people in the region that he, was witness to. 3 years later, when he returned, he said there were only 300,000 alive. Even if his numbers are off and his percentages are fairly sound, it gives you an idea of the scale of death. It was immense. So this large-scale death was truly instrumental in the ability for Europeans to easily conquer Native Americans in the Americas. Now, the natives got a little bit of revenge when they sent syphilis back to Europe, where it became the AIDS of the 15th and 16th century. So a lot of back and forth with disease. And when you read in your text, that kind of falls into that concept of the Columbian exchange. Food stuff, disease, language, ideas going back and forth from Europe into the New World. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because your text and readings will cover all the various native civilizations throughout North, Middle, and South America. But just keep in mind that these were elaborate societies that emerged in the Americas. And before leaving, I do want to mention one thing, though, and that deals with the native religions. There's just not one single concept in terms of spirituality amongst natives in the Americas. And some make the mistake in assuming there was a diversity of religion amongst all Native Americans. But they all did have one thing in common, this concept of animism. And animism is this idea that everything has a spirit, plants, animals, and even inanimate objects. So I'm going to leave it there in terms of Native Americans and early exploration prior to Christopher Columbus and all these Europeans. So what I want you to do now is to get a sense of, while you're going through those readings in your text and the readings I make available for you, of how the Americas were populated by Europeans. Now look, you know that Columbus was not the first to discover the Americas. We've got evidence that Scandinavians were exploring into the Americas a heck of a lot earlier than Christopher Columbus. For example, the gentleman you're looking at there is Bjarni Herjolfsson, who in 986 AD, we know for a fact that he was in Newfoundland. And we've got evidence of that. We know he was there. I mean, my goodness, that's a good 500 years prior to Columbus. We know that Leif Erikson, about 1000 AD, reached parts of Canada. And these discoveries had been confirmed by archaeologists. Yet these first accidental contacts by Europeans did not result in any long-lasting developments like we see after Columbus's exploration. In fact, it seems that Europe quickly forgets about these 11th century North discoveries. Okay? I mean, the Irish, the Welsh, the Chinese, heck, they even claim that they have reached the Americas. But hey, like the Norse, they left no lasting legacy. Now, this is important. I want you to take good notes on this. Listen to me on this. Because that all changes with the arrival of Columbus in the 15th century. But why was there no lasting legacy of European contact prior to Columbus? In other words, why didn't the New World explode when Leif Erikson arrived in 1000 AD? Or Bjarni? Or if the Irish are correct, or the Welsh are correct, or the Chinese are correct, why didn't it explode like it did in the 15th and 16th centuries? And the answer lies in the political and socio-economic situation of medieval Europe. Now look, this is not a world history course, so this is going to be an extremely brief summary of what's going on, but I think you should know. And here we go. Europe was in a political disarray after the 5th century and the fall of the Roman Empire. Add to that Germanic invasions, Viking attacks, and Muslim attacks throughout the southeastern portions of the Mediterranean. Europe had much more important things to deal with than some silly story of somebody coming back saying, hey, I found all this rich new land across the ocean. Nobody cared. They had bigger things to worry about. Staying alive. So Europe was neither politically or economically in a position to do anything with that information they got in 1000 AD. You understand that? So by the time you get to Columbus's voyages, 500 years have passed, and Europe's trade and its commerce has revived. There's stability in Europe. You combine that with the rise of the nation states and these strong rulers and armies and countries, exploration was a likely next step in these rulers' attempts to garner new wealth and power for themselves and their nations. So the reason that 1492 is significant is that whereas the Norsemen and others may have been here first, nothing lasted, right? Then comes 1492, and nothing is the same in the Americas and Europe ever again. And for the next 400 years after Columbus, people poured out of Europe into the Americas and elsewhere, taking over the globe, right? And so by the time you get to like 1900, there's only 3 major places not inhabited or controlled by Europeans left on planet Earth. Places like Ethiopia, Asia, Thailand, and Japan. Well, anyway, just keep some of this in mind as you read your chapter and your materials concerning these early European trips like Christopher Columbus's voyages, okay? So, one more thing to kind of get you where we need to be before actually getting those individuals to the east coast of what will one day be the United States, so we can actually start U.S. history. By the 1570s, right, the late 16th century, wealth from the Americas has now made Spain a wealthy nation. And you're going to read about that. They had the strongest navy, and therefore they controlled the Atlantic Ocean and contact with the Americas to a very large degree. By the late 16th century, other Europeans, England in particular, began to see that there was something to be gained in the Americas. And some individuals saw a fortune to be made in piracy. These were called the Spanish Sea Dogs. Guys like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Walter Raleigh, right? The guy from Roanoke Island. We'll talk more about him later. Now, at first, the Queen of England was mad at these individuals because they caused her a lot of problems with Spain and her king. I mean, Elizabeth had her hands full as it was trying to keep the Spanish king's offer of marriage at bay, right? But once she realized the money that these sea dogs were bringing in, she actually secretly invested in their voyages to raise money and revenue for the crown. And if you like swashbuckling novels and movies, I'm telling you, you'd really love the stories surrounding guys like Drake, Gilbert, and Raleigh. I mean, their history just comes alive on the page. And a lot of these characters you watch in movies are based actually on their real life exploits. Okay? Now, going real quickly here, what actually allowed countries such as England to eventually be able to conduct large-scale exploration and colonization in the Americas was something that was called the Spanish Armada. This happened in 1588. This is a big event you need to remember. Now again, this is not a world history course, but what happened here is that the Spanish king, old Philip, had had enough of the Sea Dogs and Elizabeth saying no to his marriage proposals. And he sent virtually everything he could sail to battle against England. And his massive navy, right, the most powerful nation on planet Earth, Spain, 1588, and its most powerful navy suffered a terrible defeat. And there's a lot of reasons to this. There's books on this. There's dissertations on this. I'm giving it to you in 6 sentences, right? Just take my word for it. They lost for a lot of reasons. This defeat signals the slow and steady decline of Spain as a world power. She's not out of it just yet, but this means she doesn't control the Atlantic Ocean with all her naval superiority any longer. And it's now going to allow countries like England and France to finally start reaching out to the New World and getting a toehold in places that eventually become these new colonies we're about to start talking about. I'll see you next time.